Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator of the Undergraduate Research Initiative at the University of Saskatchewan. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Acing the Interview with Alicia. And Alicia's going to be talking, I'll pass it over to Alicia in a moment, but I did want to start with two things. Number one, this session is our last of the summer 2022 SURE sessions. So the Student Undergraduate Research Experience, it's a program that I run. So welcome to everyone who's an undergraduate student at the University of Saskatchewan. But I also know that our videos are being picked up and shared by departments around the world. And so welcome if you happen to be finding us from wherever you may be. I stand on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis in Western Canada, and I am grateful to share this space with our First Nations and Métis colleagues and ancestors. And I too love this land of tall trees and swiftly flowing water. But with that, I will pass today acing the interview. So sort of let's assume that you are a student that's had a whole summer of research experiences or working experiences, but now you're ready to head off and find that job, nail that job. And I'm going to pass it over to Alicia, who's going to talk to you about acing the interview.
Thank you. And similar to last time I was with you guys, feel free to pop questions in the chat. If you're comfortable turning on your camera and asking them, feel free. You can ask them throughout. You don't have to wait until the end, but of course at the end we'll have time for questions as well. So we are going to get right into it. I do like to kind of give a quick overview of just job search documents. So it is really important that you review your documents prior to an interview, but you're going to have hopefully a cover letter. Typically, we would say whether it's a CV or a resume, you are applying with a cover letter. Even if it doesn't say cover letter, it's a good idea to still submit one. You have your resume, which might be for more industry-facing jobs. So it's just that 2-page document. And then potentially, depending the type of position you're applying for, it might require a CV, which of course is multiple pages. And if there's any refresher you need, there's a ton of information on these documents on our website. And in the next couple of weeks, we're actually going to be launching our new resource guide, which is really exciting as well. So there'll be printed copies outside of our office, which is in kind of off upper Placeria, and then it'll also be all online as well. So like I had said last time, studies do show that recruiters spend as little as 6 seconds reviewing a resume to determine if a candidate's suitable for a position. So your job search documents are extremely important in conveying your skills, your qualifications, and that's going to help you land the interview. It's also important to note that a lot of times hiring managers will interview people that come personally recommended to them before sorting through sometimes hundreds of applications. So when you think about networking, when you think of who do you know, and you're thinking, oh, well, I don't really want to reach out to them. It's my friend's mom or dad or aunt. It can still be very useful to rely on those connections because it might help you land an interview that you perhaps otherwise wouldn't have. Now, the purpose of an interview is to determine whether you are right for the job, but it's also to determine whether the job is right for you. So I always like to tell students to think of it as more of a conversation between you and the employer, where you're both learning about each other to determine if it's a good fit. So I know very traditionally you think it's just to see if I can get the job, to see if the employer thinks I'm a good fit for the job. And sometimes that is how it goes, especially when you're just finishing, whether it's your undergrad or graduate, you're looking for maybe that first industry job. It can just feel like I just need to get this job. But it is also important to determine if the job, if the company is a right fit for you as well. And that's something that will definitely help you in the long term. And the further you get into your career, it's something that might become more important to you as well. The interview is a really important opportunity where you get to learn about the position, you get to learn about the company, the climate, the culture, to see, is it what you were hoping for? Is it what you were expecting? And these are things that you can learn at the end of an interview, which I'll be touching on again, when they ask, do you have any questions for us? Your answer should always be yes. And then hopefully you have a few prepared questions that are not about salary, holidays, or benefits. Your interview is also a chance for you to showcase yourself, your strengths that go beyond what you wrote on your cover letter, what you have on your resume, really thinking about what you can do to stand out, to separate yourself. Like I probably mentioned this in the last presentation as well, but when you're thinking about applying for a job, let's say all of your classmates are applying for the same job. You have similar academic programs, maybe you have similar work experience. How are you going to set yourself apart in those job search documents and in an interview? So I know interviews can be very nerve-wracking, and it's something that I think it doesn't matter if you've done 1 or 20, you're still going to be a little bit nervous going into an interview. I know I certainly am. So just try to prepare as best you can. It's going to help with nerves, it's going to help with your confidence, and that is going to come through throughout the interview process. So we're just going to kind of go over a few different interview formats. So very traditionally, there can be one-on-one where there's one person interviewing you. I would say that these aren't quite as common anymore. You're typically interviewed by a minimum of 2 people. So a panel interview is where there can be multiple people asking you questions, and it can be a little bit intimidating, but it is important to remember you want to introduce yourself. You can just take a breath, try to calm down, because a panel interview I always look at as a positive, because there's going to be multiple people who you're able to impress, who you're able to stand out to in different ways. And that can help you when they're actually going to a selection part. So after all the interviews have been completed. And panels, typically I'd say there's 2 to 3 people on a panel, but there can be multiple. The biggest panel I ever interviewed in front of was 8 people. And there was some people that were zoomed in virtually, and there was some people that were there in person. So it can be a lot, even thinking of making eye contact, but a good kind of rule of thumb is whoever asks you the question is who you can kind of focus on while trying to periodically engage with other people. So looking at someone else, because typically in a panel setting, each person will take turns asking you questions. You can have a phone interview. So I don't mean a Zoom or a virtual, I mean literally a phone call. Now, it is important to be mindful of things like the sound of paper rustling. I know it can be tempting to write out answers, write out examples, and it's okay to have points jotted down, but you definitely want to make sure you're not coming off scripted. On the phone too, it can be a little bit intimidating if there's moments of silence. So it could be the person's taking notes, it could be they're reviewing the next question, and you don't have to fill every silence. You want to make sure that you introduce yourself. This is a good rule of thumb, no matter the format of interview, and definitely be aware if there's more than one, and it can be hard on the phone because of course you can't see anyone. Make sure with phone and virtual that you're aware of the time zone you're interviewing in, so there's not any issue there, and especially you don't want to miss it because your calendar was set to a different time zone. Now, sometimes it's important to note that there can be multiple interview formats for one position. So one example that I always like to share is a number of years ago, I had applied for a mat leave position. So it was just a 1-year term, and I received a phone call from the hiring manager. And the phone call, they asked a bunch of questions. It was kind of like a pre-interview. And then I ended up getting called in for an actual interview, and I ended up getting the position. And after I got the position, I learned that this particular hiring manager used phone interviews as a way to screen candidates that they weren't sure if they were qualified for the position. So little did I know when I was on the phone interview that it was actually a pre-screening method to see if I had the experience needed for this position. So don't be alarmed as well if a hiring manager uses a term like this is a screening call or a pre-screening call or a pre-interview. Don't let that startle you. And on this phone call particularly, I was very honest. I remember actually hanging up thinking, there's no way I'm getting an interview for this position. I was asked a lot of questions about Excel and some different softwares, and I didn't have a ton of experience with them, and I was honest about that. I was also honest about if this was an important role of the position, I would be very interested in getting more training with things like Excel. With Microsoft, there's lots of things you can Google, but I was very honest about there was limitations I had with some of this. So when it ended, I remember thinking, no way am I getting an interview. And I did, and I ended up getting the position. So sometimes these things can be nerve-wracking if you're told up front what they are, but try not to let that sway you or make you more nervous, because it can still have an extremely positive outcome. Now, something during COVID that we're probably all familiar with is virtual interviewing. And it's something that might be here to stay with certain companies if they have hiring managers in different territories, cities, provinces, even countries that they want to loop in. Now there's more and more that can be a combo. Some people are in person, some people are virtual. And there is some things that you want to prepare beforehand in terms of taking time to make sure that your screen is okay, that your background is clean, professional, making sure you have a quiet space. You also want to make sure that it's not going to be too dark where your face is in the camera. So for example, I'm in my office on campus today. It's very dark where my computer is, so I actually have a ring light sitting behind my laptop to just help light my face so it's not as dark. So you want to be mindful of things like that. Again, time zone, very, very important. You don't want to miss an interview, and you want to make sure you're not going to be super distracted. So maybe that means leaving your phone in another room or silencing it and turning it over. You want to make sure you're professionally dressed, at least from the waist up. And I always tell students, even if it's a virtual interview or a phone interview, wear the appropriate clothes. Maybe don't wear the full suit that you would wear to an interview, but be business casual, because it is going to help you with your confidence and kind of with your mood when you're going into that. There's also some other forms of interviews, such as dining or reception. Typically, a dining or reception interview will be a second or even a third interview. So maybe you've had a panel interview, maybe at a phone call and a panel interview, and then you're going to be invited out for a dining or reception interview. And sometimes with dining and reception interviews, and sometimes even panel interviews, some companies will interview multiple candidates at the same time. So again, that can be really nerve-wracking, but you just want to try to prepare yourself as best as you can. You can be asked to give a presentation in a job interview. I have had to give multiple presentations for different job interviews, and that is an area for me that has really helped me land a few positions, because it is a strength of mine. In the first job I ever applied to on campus, was in the College of Ag Bio. It was a recruitment and student advising position, and I had to prepare a presentation. I think it was on like strategies for engaging with prospective and new students. And so, I did a bit of research. I came up with a couple of ideas and gave this presentation. I was successful in getting that job. And then I learned afterwards that I was the only candidate who actually answered the question that they had given. So again, even if presentations are your strong suit, it can be really nerve-wracking, but it can really be something that helps you land that job. So prepare and try not to be too nervous, because remember, you're trying to figure out, is it a good fit for the company and is it a good fit for you? Something that's kind of emerging more and more, and depending on your industry might be common, is having assessments or testing or a case style portion of an interview. So sometimes it can be something you do ahead of time, it can be something you do during the interview, or it can be something that you were asked to do after the interview. And this can be something such as, I was just part of a hiring committee for a position in our office, and we actually, at the end of the interview, after we had asked our questions, we did and they were instructed about this ahead of time, but we did a role play. So one of the people on the panels did a role play with the candidate. And so these are things that can come up. You will, I'm going to say 99% of the time, be notified in advance if this is going to be happening at an interview, or if it's something that they'll ask you to do after, they might bring it up at the interview. So again, try not to be too concerned about it. It is an area that can just help you land the job and figure out if it's a good fit for you. One thing that's becoming more and more common, I would say, is recorded answers. And what that means is some companies have moved to a format where instead of scheduling an interview with you 3 o'clock on Wednesday, they're going to send you a link. And they'll say you have to have this completed by this date. And when you go into that link, it's going to be you pre-recording or recording your answers to questions. So a question will pop up on the screen. You'll have 30 seconds to read it, and then you'll have 2 minutes to answer it. And then it automatically changes and goes to the next question. So that's something that can be really, really nerve-wracking. But again, if you prepare, you'll feel more confident going into it. And it is completely normal to be nervous going into an interview and even being nervous the entire time. I've been told I interview very well, and it's still nerve-wracking going into interviews. It's still nerve-wracking throughout that process. So just remember, an interview is an opportunity for you to get to know the employer as well as them get to know you. And that's something that a lot of times people don't think about, especially when trying to land that first job and it's just, I need a job. I remember applying to everything coming out of my undergrad and just thinking, I need a job. I'm not too concerned even where it is. And you're kind of applying to everything. Once you get into your career, really trying to make sure that you're in a position that's a good fit or a company that's a good fit becomes more important. Now, when you're preparing for an interview, it's a little bit similar to preparing your job search documents or preparing a LinkedIn or updating a LinkedIn. You are getting ready to market yourself. So thinking of those abilities, skills, strengths, interests, goals, achievements, experiences, whether it's school, work, volunteering. A lot of times, the best applicants are those who are very well-rounded. So you don't want to focus 100% on work experience. You don't want to focus 100% on academics. You really want to find a good mix. And while that's a good rule of thumb for your job search documents, it's also a good rule of thumb for interviews and thinking about experiences you might be drawing on to answer questions. You want to be confident when you're discussing decisions you've made. So a lot of those behavioral-based questions and the thought process involved. So I know it can be tempting to maybe focus on really positive experiences where there was this great outcome, everything went perfectly, but that's not necessarily how things go all the time. Typically, that's not how they go. So having those experiences ready, but also thinking about an experience that you really learned something about yourself, or maybe it wasn't a really positive experience, or maybe it didn't end in a great grade, but looking back on that reflection piece and commenting on that, it does make it an experience you can talk about in an interview. And that reflection, so that thinking back to what would I do differently? Would that have changed the outcome? What did I learn from that? Those are things that employers are looking for that a lot of times it's harder to teach those. So thinking of those transferable skills, competencies, strengths, soft skills, kind of whatever you want to call them, thinking about those can be really, really important. This is also something where you can think about what's really important to you. What accomplishments really stand out? What are you really proud of? And again, even thinking in those moments, what would you do differently? That reflection piece, what would I do differently? How am I going to take this forward in my future are very, very important. You want to think about that translation of personal strengths and skills that are relevant to the organization or position. So as much as I'm talking about you want to stand out, what's really important to you, you want to make sure you're tying this back to the job you're applying for and to the company you're applying to. So saving your job posting is so important. Every job you apply to, you should save the posting, whether it's a printout, whether it's on your desktop or USB, OneDrive, whatever it is, save it, because when you're preparing for an interview, being able to review that job posting can be really, really helpful. Similar to preparing for your job search documents, you want to make sure you've done your research. You want to know the employer, know the industry. Like I said last time, I'm not talking about hours and hours of research, even a 15-minute Google search. And this is something you want to do preparing for your interview, but maybe also right before the interview. So looking at the company website, mission statement, vision statement, looking at their social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever they might have, just seeing what's been posted, different things like that. And it can help you stand out throughout the interview process if you incorporate words from the company's mission statement or vision statement, if you can find a way to tie yourself to maybe something that's important to them. Some companies, they'll post lots about causes that are important to them or community involvement they do. And finding natural ways to tie yourself to that, if it actually is something that's important to you or you're involved in, can just be helpful in creating those natural connections. And looking for connections. Is there anyone you know who currently works for the company? Is there anyone in your network who knows someone who works for that company? And most employers will ask at some point in an interview, what do you know about our organization? And you want to be ready to answer that, even if it's talking about something that you saw on their social media. It doesn't have to be a really, really scripted, well, your mission statement is, and I really relate to that because, and maybe it is something like that. But it can be, oh, when I was preparing for this interview, and it's similar to when I was preparing my resume, I was looking at the website and your guys' social media, and I really love how you're really involved in your community and you participate in these 3 initiatives. It can even be something like that that's not directly tied to the work you're doing or the work that the company's doing, but they just want to show, did you take the time to Google them to see what they're up to? And that's a lot of times what that question is looking for. So you want to make sure that you are prepared to answer that question. So the 4 R's of preparation, like we just talked about, researching the position and company, looking at their current news and social media, reflecting and taking inventory of your skills and abilities, very, very important. You want to read and reread your cover letter and resume. So you do this so you're not repeating exactly what's on your cover letter specifically, where you've given more detail on examples. And this is also where you would be reviewing the job posting. You want to review common interview questions, because in so many interviews, you will be asked a question about conflict, about team work, about a time that you took a leadership role. There are some common themes when it comes to behavioral questions. So you want to think about, don't memorize a script, that's not what I'm saying, but just think about what experiences might you want to draw on for some of those more typical interview questions that there's a good chance you're going to be asked. And then it allows you to think, oh, I have a really good example from my academics. Oh, I have a really good example from my part-time job. It allows you to pull on different types of examples. Something that should also be in here as well is when you're researching, also research, and this is more so for industry career positions and not a summer student or part-time position, but researching what is the salary range for this type of position, for similar positions within this industry, because sometimes in an interview at the end, you will be asked what your salary expectation is. And you never want to just give one number. You always want to at least give a range. And sometimes they'll ask you how you came up with that number. So being able to say that you did some research, you found industry averages, is going to just help you validate that range, because you're never just going to give one number. And it's something that if it does come up in an interview, it can be uncomfortable, but you can always ask them to explain the salary range for that position, and the range you're going to be giving them is based on industry average and your experience. It's also important to be realistic. If you're looking at entry-level positions, if you're looking at industry averages and you're thinking, man, like I didn't think it was going to be that low. A lot of times it can be not exactly what you want in that first career position, but then it's important to set your goals and have a plan on how you're hoping to advance. And it's also a conversation you can have when you start in a position, and you can ask some questions about it at the end of an interview in terms of chances for promotion. You can ask if it's a company that values promoting within, and just ways that you can ensure that you're being successful in your position. And then just that's going to help you be able to advance. Now, typically the interview will start with the question, tell me a bit about yourself. So we like to use this acronym PAUSE, and you can kind of play around with it a little bit. So just because the acronym is PAUSE, you don't have to start with the personal. You could switch it to WASP and start with work and end with personal. So what we're saying with this is, when you get asked, tell us a bit about yourself, they're not looking for a 10-minute life story. They're looking for about 60 to 120 seconds, so 1 to 2 minutes. And this is where, if you highlight, one work, one academic, one skill or strength, one personal tidbit, that's what this acronym is for. And you can kind of play around with it. For me personally, I always like to kind of start, when I was younger, I would start with my academics. Now that I'm further into my career, I would always start with a work. I would include my academics, a strength of mine that is tied to the position I'm applying to, and then a personal kind of tidbit. So it could be a hobby of yours, it could be an interest of yours. And for me, growing up, I grew up on an elk farm, so ELK, the cervid industry, and I'm still super involved in that industry. So that's a tip that I would like to give because it's really unique to me. It's going to help me stand out in their mind. And it's also showing that I'm involved in something outside of my 8 to 5 job. But it's also important to remember that no matter what examples you're giving, you are keeping it professional. So when you get to behavioral-based questions, we also have another acronym that can help you answer them. So it can be SOAR or STAR. And how that changes is, was it an obstacle or a task? And this is to help you frame your answer, because a lot of times behavioral-based questions can be really lengthy. So sometimes it's like 2 to 4 questions within one question, and they can be long. But try to breathe when you're answering these, because the reason you're getting asked a behavioral-based question is future performance is best predicted by past behavior. So the employer is looking at, how did you handle tough situations? Were you able to adapt? Were you able to think on your feet? Were you able to be successful? And this is where it's important, where earlier I mentioned you can give an example that maybe didn't have a really, really positive outcome, but the reflection piece is key. And it's also key to know you don't want to give every answer with a situation that wasn't positive. So you want to have a mix of experiences that show you in a really good light and experiences that were maybe a bit more difficult, but remember that reflection piece. And this is also because it can be easy sometimes when the questions are really long, maybe a little bit confusing, that you kind of start talking and you're trying to think about your answer in your brain, and you're still talking and you're still talking, and it's 5 minutes later and you're still talking, and you've kind of lost your train of thought. You don't even know if you're answering the question anymore. And using an acronym can help ensure that that doesn't happen. And it's also important to know, in an interview, if you get asked a question, or when you get asked a question, you don't have to respond immediately. You can pause for up to 10 seconds and think about your answer, and it's completely acceptable. If you need more than 10 seconds, if it's a really tricky question, and you'll probably get a few of those, you can just say, I'm just going to take a moment to collect my thoughts for my answer. And then that gives you about 30 seconds to kind of think. You want to try not to go much beyond that. And this is going to help you from using those filler words. So if you just immediately think you need to start talking, and you're thinking about your answer as you start talking, it might come out something like, well, when I was in my third year, I had a project that I had to do. It was a group project, and our topic was, and you're using these filler words because you're trying to think about what you're going to say. Whereas if you just say, oh, great question, and then you take 5 to 10 seconds to think about how you're going to answer it, it's going to help eliminate those filler words, which is just going to really help you stand out in a more positive light. Now, sometimes with these tricky questions, especially when it's multiple questions in one question, and you're already nervous, you're thinking, they just finished asking me the question and I don't even know what the question is. Once, maybe twice, you can ask them to repeat or rephrase the question. You don't really want to do that more than once or twice, but that is definitely acceptable to do. And something that you can actually do with behavioral-based questions is you can use this acronym. So you can, as you're framing your answer, you can say, the situation was, we had a group project, it was in the third year of my undergrad, and so you can actually use the acronym as you're answering. And sometimes, even if you like interviews or have done a lot of interviews, you get to the end of answering a question and you're thinking, did I even answer the question? And so you can say that again a couple of times, not every time, but once or twice on those tricky questions, you can say, did that answer your question? And then they'll ask a probing question if need be. So these behavioral-based questions, you're typically being asked to describe a specific situation, how it was handled, what were the details, what was the outcome, and you really want to think about that reflection piece is really, really important. So that thinking of, what did I learn? What stood out to me? What would I do differently if I was in a similar situation again? Or going back, especially if you're using an example that didn't have a really positive outcome. Sorry, there's just a fly in my office that startled me. That didn't really have a very positive outcome. You can even reflect back and say, well, if I would have done this differently, I think it would have changed the outcome. And in the future, if I'm in a similar type of position, I would do X, Y, and Z differently. So those are different things you can do that are just going to help you stand out. Now, when you're preparing for these, you're going to get asked a few of them, regardless of your industry, for sure. So if you go to our website, we have a ton of resources on commonly asked questions, and even just Googling commonly asked questions. And you can even Google common questions for your industry if it's something specific. Now, another question that can be really hard to answer is, what is your biggest weakness? And this can be tricky because if presenting is part of the job you're applying for, you don't want to say that your biggest weakness is your presentation skills. So if it's something that's required for the position, you don't want to say that that's your biggest weakness. Now, you don't want to lie in a job interview either, because it's going to come out. So when you talk about what your biggest weakness is, you also want to talk about how you're working to improve upon it. And that can be a really important piece. It's also important to note, I like to tell students anyways, you don't want to pick a weakness that's actually a positive. So some people will commonly say, well, my biggest weakness is I'm such a go-getter and I can't say no to people, so I just take on more work, where that's not really a true weakness. It's a weakness in some sense, but some employers would look at that as actually a positive. So you don't want to use a cliche weakness that isn't actually a weakness, but you want to be truthful. So let's say hypothetically, presentation was not part of the job you applied for, And presentation is something that you struggle with a little bit. You could say public speaking, presentations in front of large groups is an area that it's not my biggest strength, but it's an area that I do want to improve upon. Maybe you are seeking out opportunities to present in class, to ask questions in class. Maybe you joined a local Toastmasters group that allows you to practice some of those skills. So you want to say something, but then you also want to include kind of how you're working on getting better in it. And just remember that if it's a key requirement for the job you're applying for, you maybe don't want to specifically say that's your biggest weakness unless you are directly asked by your employer. But even then, you can say that you are very interested in participating in different courses or professional development to get better in that area. In the example that I gave earlier about when I was pre-screened with the phone interview, Excel was really important to the job, and I did not have really any Excel experience, and I was honest about it. But I was honest about I'm willing to take a course, and a lot of Microsoft questions are Googleable. So you just want to kind of give that context that you're at least willing to really work on it if you don't have specific ideas. So something you can do that can be helpful, because typically this question comes with what's one of your greatest strengths and what's your biggest weakness. So in our office, we have something called assessments, and there's one assessment in particular called Clifton Strengths. And when you do that assessment, it's going to give you your top 5 talent themes. And this can be really helpful when you're trying to figure out how to answer these questions. So for example, when I did my Clifton Strengths assessment, my number 1 talent theme or strength that came out was woo, which stands for winning others over. And it was never something that I considered a strength of mine. I just thought it's my personality. I like to talk to people. I don't mind giving presentations, and it's just who I am. It's my personality. It's not a strength. But doing the Clifton Strengths assessment helped me realize, no, this is actually a strength that I should be marketing, because we all have different strengths and no one's going to be great at everything. So it can really, doing an assessment like that, meeting with a career coach to debrief, which you can do all of those things in our office, they can help you when you're answering some of these questions. They can also help you just going into an interview where you get, if you do an assessment, you get a full report back. And a lot of it, they'll say like typically woos, and then they give examples of how it's utilized in your life, in professional and personal, and it just can help you frame some of your answers to those behavioral based questions. And it's just really important to remember when you're answering what is your biggest weakness, that it is something you are working to improve upon, and you want to show the interviewers that you're actively working on that to overcome that weakness. And we all have strengths and weaknesses. Nobody's great at everything, and that is completely okay. You just want to be prepared for that question, because it is another common one that comes up. So some of the key questions are, tell me about yourself. Why did you choose to study your program? What do you know about our organization? What are your long-term career goals? How are you a good fit for this organization? So that why should we hire you question. Why are you interested in this position? And what are your strengths and weaknesses? Now, with some of the questions, it's really important to note, this might seem very obvious, but very important to note, you never want to say, I just need a job. And sometimes that is why you're applying for jobs. I remember coming out of my post-secondary, that was my mindset. I just wanted a job. I needed a job. But I would never say that in an interview. So you can think about what inspired you to apply for the job, what drew you to this posting or to this company, and you can even think about why you chose, if you're applying for jobs that are in a specific industry tied to your academic program, you can even think about what drew you to that program and figure out a way to tie it into what drew you to the industry, what drew you to the company, what drew you to that position. And it might be a place where you discuss some of your short-term or long-term goals and how this position might contribute to them. It is also important to note that how would the company benefit from having you as part of their team, and how would you benefit from this position can kind of go hand in hand. So again, thinking about What drew you to it? What drew you to your program? What drew you to that industry? And making those personal connections are going to help you stand out in a really positive way throughout the interview process. Now, we've come to the end of the interview and they ask, do you have any questions for us? Your answer is always yes. Always yes. Some people, some employers, some hiring managers, if you don't have questions ready for them at the end, even if it's just one or two simple ones, that might impact you actually getting the position. Because asking a question at the end, it shows that you're interested in working for this company. And maybe not exactly this position, there could be other positions that you don't even know about, they're not posted yet, but it shows that you're interested in this position. You're not just applying for everything under the sun and doing all the interviews, and maybe you are, but it shows that you've put some thought and preparation into this interview. So you do want to have thoughtful questions prepared, and your questions should maybe demonstrate research you've done into the organization position. They shouldn't be questions that can just be answered by reading the job posting. So a question, for example, like, well, who does this position report to? It probably says in the job posting who this reports to. If it doesn't, that would be a question I would ask, but typically that is something that's in the posting. You never want to ask questions related to salary, benefits, vacation, anything like that. Those are questions you get into when you actually get offered the position, and that can go into your negotiations. So it's important to think about questions you might have to figure out if the company is a good fit for you. So one question that can be great is actually asking the hiring manager or the panel their favorite aspect of working for that company. You can ask, what does a typical day look like for this position? You can also ask questions that might further help your advancement. So for example, hypothetically, I'm the successful candidate. 6 months in, how will I know I'm being successful in this position? You can kind of, I'm going to say, toe the line a little bit with questions around, does the company value professional development, whether it's financially or paid time off? There's some questions, if they're really important to you, you can ask them at this point, but you want to try to avoid the generic questions here. Typically, we like to say you have 3 to 5 questions prepared. So you can ask things around training, mentorship. We already talked about that. How will I know if I'm succeeding? And one that I do really like is, what is the hiring manager's or panel's favorite aspect of working for that company? Because it's going to give you insight into that specific company's culture. So just some other tips: send a follow-up email, a thank you, within 48 hours after your interview. You do want to be ready early. So if it's in person, you're maybe arriving 10 to 15 minutes early. If it's virtual or phone, you're ready in your quiet space. Your tech is set up. You want to practice answering those common questions, and you can even practice them in a mirror to see, do you have any mannerisms or even coping that you might do when you're nervous that you don't realize? So for me, I'm a big hand talker. I really like to talk with my hands, and sometimes it can be useful to drive home a point, but sometimes it can also be distracting if you're doing it the whole time. So what I do when I'm giving presentations and in an interview is I'll kind of clasp my hands in my lap, and that just helps them from continually being in the screen or continually talking with them. So answering at least one question in the mirror can be helpful. You want to, and again, this might seem silly, if it's a phone interview or a virtual interview, and if you live alone, warm up your vocal cords. So have something to drink, sing along to a song, practice a common question, but I know it might sound silly, but actually warm up your vocal cords. So when you answer the phone or start your interview, you don't have that just woke up voice. A lot of industry is moving towards the recorded. So that's where practice and research are really, really important. If it's going to an in-person interview, you want to bring multiple copies of your resume with you. You always want to notify your references. So what I used to do is I would save my job posting. I always put references available upon request. And then at an interview, I brought my references printed out on a piece of paper, gave it to the panel or the hiring manager. And then I would always tell my references, oh, I had an interview, or I have an interview on Tuesday, and I would give them a copy of the job posting and a copy of my job search document, so my cover letter resume. And that helped them really speak to the strengths of mine that were tied to the position I was applying to. And essentially, you just get a much richer reference. So things like that can be really helpful as well, but always notify your references and always ask your references. That might seem silly. Some people just put people down and then they get a call and it's like, oh, I didn't even know I was a reference for this person. And again, it might seem silly, but if you're using references like a professor or a super or past supervisor, just you can even ask, would you give me a positive reference? Because you want to make sure that you're not putting someone down who isn't going to give you a positive reference. You want to have a professional voicemail recorded. So it's not going to be a voicemail with screaming and background music where it sounds like you're at a concert or a party. You want to have a professional voicemail kind of ready when, especially when you're going through the job search process. Just to recap, we're getting prepared. We're rereading job posting and application package. We're reviewing the company website and social media. You're updating your LinkedIn. If you put something on your resume, put it on your LinkedIn. You're going to be practicing those common questions and make sure your social media settings, privacy settings are set, because a lot of times they will Google you. You're going to have maybe some examples prepared for those common questions and what's your biggest weakness? Tell me a bit about yourself. You're going to try to get organized ahead of time. So what are you wearing? If you're going somewhere, where are you parking? Can you do a drive-by the night before? Can you take the bus the day before? How long does it take you to get there? Where is the building? I remember my very first interview on campus. I drove here from Alberta. I was finishing my education in Alberta. I drove here for the interview, and actually the night before I drove to campus, I parked and I went into the Ag building and I found the room I was going to. So if that's possible, sometimes it's not. If it's a large corporation, they will lock their doors in the evening. But if you can do that, again, that helps with your nerves, where you're parking, where's the bus drop off, things like that. And always be dressed to impress and ready early. So kind of a rule of thumb, especially for in-person interviews, is kind of dress one level up than you think you will be for if you were to be a successful candidate. Breathe. It's okay to be nervous. It's okay to take a breath. That is completely natural. You're going to research the industry for salary ranges. You're not going to ask about that in the interview. You're going to be realistic and always give a range, and know that a lot of times summer positions or part-time positions are not negotiable. You're always going to have a few questions prepared to ask them. There's just some examples there that we've already kind of recapped. You are going to wait until an offer is made to really get into salary, benefits, vacation, things like that. And you're going to send a follow-up within 48 hours, just thanking them for taking the time, for you coming in for an interview. And don't worry if it's a panel. You don't have to remember everyone's name. You probably have an email from, it might have been an admin assistant, it might have been from the hiring manager, and you can always just say, please pass on my email to the rest of the hiring committee. So you don't even have to list all their names, because sometimes if you're going in and there's multiple people and you're already nervous, you're not going to remember everyone's name, and that's okay. Just kind of a quick note on salary negotiation. So when you're really starting those full-time career positions, you should always ask, is the salary negotiable? Typically, it is. There might not be a huge range, and they won't tell you the range, but you should always try to negotiate. It's something that even my very first job out of university, I negotiated, and I tried to negotiate pretty hard actually, and we ended up meeting in the middle. So it is something that when you get offered a number. If you get offered a salary for that position, you can say, oh, like, thank you, that's a great offer. I'm really excited about this opportunity, but I was wondering, is the salary negotiable? And the hiring manager, the HR person, whoever you're talking to, they might chuckle a little. It is something that most do expect to be asked, and they'll either say, this is our starting salary, there's no wiggle room. That's when you can ask about benefits and get into some other things. And sometimes they might say, well, it's a little bit negotiable. And that just means there's not a huge range. So that's where having the research, and if comfortable, you can talk to classmates or friends who are in similar positions to say, like, what was your starting salary? And there's a ton of information online. And remember, treat your negotiation as a conversation. You don't want to come off aggressive or overly confident, but you do want to be able to persuade them. So just saying, well, I want to make more money, I think I deserve to make more money, that's not going to get you a higher salary. You want to be able to persuade them by giving specific examples. So for me, when I was getting offered the position in Ag Bio, which was student recruitment and student advising, my last 3 summer jobs throughout university had been at the post-secondary institution I was attending. I was very involved in student leadership and different things like that. I worked part-time at those institutions, and I actually worked in the recruitment office. So I had a huge knowledge in that area. And I used that when I was trying to persuade my way to a higher starting salary. So you need to be prepared to give examples as to why you think you deserve a higher starting salary. And sometimes the salary is not negotiable, but you can think beyond the paycheck. So is there any annual bonuses? Is there professional development funds? Is there a pension plan, stock options, extra vacation days? Is it flexible where you can work hybrid? So partially at home, partially in the office. You want to think like that. And it's something that it's not too fun at the first job to be thinking about pension plans, but trust me, as you get into your career, that becomes really, really important. So for example, I've been on campus for 10 years. I do not plan on leaving. And while I maybe don't make as much salary-wise as I would if I was out in industry, the benefit package is something that you would typically not get outside of the university unless you were in a government type position. So think about those, think beyond the paycheck, because that is compensation as well. It's just not on your monthly or biweekly paycheck. And you're always going to remember to give a range, not a specific number. And even that's a good rule of thumb, even when you're negotiating. So if you're offered 50,000 and you really wanted 60,000, 10,000 is a pretty big gap. So it's likely you wouldn't get the 60, but you can give your persuading examples and say, I was thinking more of the range between 55 and 60,000 a year. And then hopefully they can come up to that 55, or they'll maybe meet in the middle. So those are just some tips for salary negotiation. A few things just to note on contract review. So you've settled on salary, you're going to get a contract that you're going to have to sign. So in that contract, there's typically information about your benefits. So things, pension, health, dental. This is a really important note, really, really important to note, are they company paid or employee paid premiums? And what I mean by that, and I'll give you an example of a friend of mine actually, who she's earlier in her career, she switched positions, and she went from having employer, so company paid benefits. So she had negotiated this higher salary, she was switching companies, she was all excited, she gets her paycheck and she sees that at the new company, it's employee paid premiums. So it was, I think, $50 or $75 every paycheck that comes off because it's employee paid premiums and not company. And so there's little things like that that you just want to be aware of, and that's going to be in the contract. Especially if you're looking at multiple contracts, maybe you've got a couple of different offers, noting these little things can be really important. You want to make sure you understand the employment term. So are you being hired as a term employee? So there's an end date. Is it full-time? Is it permanent? Is it a contract? So is it a 2-year term? So things like that. And that typically would be in the job posting as well. So you just want to make sure it matches in the contract. There might be something in there about performance. So are there measures for additional compensation, such as raises, bonuses? If it's commission at all, there should be information about that in there. And a really important one is a non-compete clause. And this can be dependent upon the industry. But what it is it's an attempt by an employer to stop an employee from working for a competitor or starting their own competing company. So it can just be important to note, is there a non-compete clause in your contract? And of course, a termination clause. So what happens to constitute disciplinary action? What is the applicable process, grounds for termination, severance package details? Those are important things to note as well. And if anything's vague, if you are unsure about something, just ask, just follow up and ask, because you want to be clear when you're making that decision. The note on social media, I've already said, make sure your privacy settings are set for everything personal, and make sure your LinkedIn is up to date. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. You can actually schedule mock interviews with our office where you kind of go through the interview process informally. So that can be a great way to help you prepare for an interview as well.
That is a great way to prepare. High recommend. I did put a link to Student Career Services into the chat, so make sure that you take a look at that link and find. You know, I was just thinking I should do the Clifton strengths. I've never done that. I'm like, hey, that would be really cool. I'd like to know what my Clifton strengths are. Alicia, I did have a question as you were going through. I'm going to keep the recording on because I'd like to hear your response to this. One of the things that I will often do, because I'm a visual person, and so I actually often take a pen and a notebook in with me when I go for an interview, and I'll actually write down a question that, you know, just so that I've got something visual that I can refer back to, and then my mind can kind of process that. It's like, is that actually the question that I answered? The question that, you know, so do you recommend that, or is that just a weird Merle thing?
No, you can do that. And actually, I was just on a hiring committee for a position in our office. And even though they were virtual, I could tell that the candidate we ended up hiring, she was doing that throughout the interview as well. So if that is the way that you absorb questions and information, yes, bring a pad of paper and you can jot those things down. I would say don't worry about getting it word for word, but writing down some of those key words on what you're supposed to be answering you can do. You can bring your questions on a sheet of paper as well. And something that, again, people don't think about, you can bring your own coffee. You can bring a bottle of water. It's okay to take, you've seen me, I've been taking a couple of drinks throughout this presentation because I'm literally talking at you for an hour, and an interview is the same thing. So you can bring that bottle of water or coffee, and you can bring a pad of paper. Yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much for that presentation today. I am going to stop the recording. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us today, but we'll still be here to answer any additional questions.
And I'll send you my slides.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.